Construction projects, you see them all around. Maybe you've even been a part of one. As you're getting ready to build, there are some important aspects to consider. Well, obviously the foundation is the key. The foundation is what everything else is built on. And God was getting ready to build a nation of people whose foundation would be their ability to trust in the sovereignty of God. Another important aspect is the making of promises. Promises about when the project would be completed or the total cost of the project. When you consider that, you take the reputation of the company and the knowledge of the superintendent into play. Well, in God's way, we understand that because of who He is, the promises that He would make to us would be sure. They would provide the ability, this great foundation on which God would build an entire nation. As chapter 2 of the story begins, it's moving day for Abraham. Now, you've moved before. You know all that it takes and all the preparations to get ready. I mean, you start going through your house weeks before. Maybe you do 3 different piles, the keep, the sell, and the throw out. Then you have a yard sale and you try to get rid of as much as you can that way. Maybe you're like me and you pack your boxes and you color code them so you know when you unload where it's to go. But now imagine it's moving day, but you don't know where you're moving to. I mean, the boxes are packed, the U-Haul's loaded, and you have no idea where to go. That's what happened with Abraham. Now the Lord said to Abraham, "Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you." When describing faith, the author of Hebrews used Abraham as an example. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance, and he went out, not knowing where he was going. Abraham faithfully followed God. He was building this relationship on the foundation of trust between he and God. By the way, Abraham was 75 years old at the time. God was relocating Abraham and starting a building project. He was getting ready to build a nation of people that would be his very own, a people that he would know personally. And when God builds, he builds big. And the Lord said to Abram after Lot had separated from him, "Now lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land which you see, I will give it to you and your descendants forever. And I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your descendants can also be numbered." But there was one problem, but it was a big problem. Abraham didn't have any children. I mean, how could Abraham think about all the descendants he would have when he didn't even have the first one yet? And then we read this great verse in the Bible. Then he believed in the Lord, and he reckoned it to him as righteousness. Based upon Abraham's faith in God, he believed what God said. And this belief would allow Abraham the joy of becoming the father of a nation. It was a belief based upon the foundation and trust between he and God. Although Abraham believed, he and Sarah still had not gotten pregnant. Now, they knew that Abraham was part of God's plan, but they weren't sure about Sarah. So they took matters into their own hands. They did something that's very unusual by today's standards. But Abraham would have a child through one of Sarah's handmaidens. And so Hagar has a son. But that wasn't God's plan. But isn't it the same for you and me? Don't we at times think that we can help God with his plans? Well, a child through someone other than Sarah was not what God wanted. And so after 13 years, when Abraham is the ripe old age of 100, he and Sarah have a son. God showed himself to be a faithful promise maker. His word would be true. This was the basis, this was the foundation that he was building his relationship with Israel upon. Years later, Joshua would recall the faithfulness of God and the trustworthiness of his promises. Not one of the good promises which the Lord had made to the house of Israel failed. All came to pass. So how do you think Abraham felt when God asked him to sacrifice Isaac? I mean, Isaac was the one that God was going to use to build all the nation, and yet now he was being asked to kill him. I mean, what was it like when God asked Abraham to do something that just didn't make sense? Has that ever happened to you? God asked you to do something that really didn't make sense? I mean, I remember in my life, just not too long ago, when I was involved in a ministry and God had me leave that ministry. And it didn't make sense. But what I came to realize is that having faith when you understand everything, that's really not faith at all. Rather, the bigger challenge is trusting in God when you don't understand it. That's a true mark of faith. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. and he who had received the promises was offering up his only begotten son. It was he to whom it was said, "In Isaac your descendants shall be called." He considered that God is able to raise men even from the dead, from which he also received him back as a type. It was Abraham's faithfulness, in spite of not understanding all that God would want to do, that would be the true mark of his trusting in God. As God builds a people to be his own, he gives them all the reason in the world to believe in him. He's building them a relationship based upon his ability to be trusted. You and I have the privilege of walking day to day with God, built on this strong foundation of trust. Chapter 2 of the story ends with the story of Abraham's grandson, Jacob. Now, Jacob was, well, a little less than perfect, someone I think we can all identify with. Abraham, his grandfather, was a superhero of the faith. Abraham followed God when he didn't know where he was going. He trusted that God would be true to his word and provide him with descendants. And even after he had a son, Abraham obeyed God and was willing to sacrifice him. If Abraham was a superhero, well, Jacob was just kind of an ordinary guy. In fact, at times he wasn't even that good. Actually, Jacob was a deceiver from the beginning. Is this the kind of person that God could even use? Amazingly, the answer is yes. And the story of Jacob reminds us that God's plans will succeed even in spite of our shortcomings.